June 1944. The Belarusian Front. For the German soldiers of Army Group Center, the war has become a thing of eerie silence. After 3 years of titanic struggle, the front line here, bulging deep into Soviet territory, is now the quietest sector on the entire Eastern Front. The men of the 9th, 4th, and 3rd Panzer Armies occupy well-prepared defenses, trenches dug into the forests and marshlands. Their commanders read intelligence reports from the Oberkommando des Heers, OKH, confirming their own observations. The Russians are exhausted. The strategic reserves are gone. When the great Soviet summer offensive finally comes, and it will fall far to the south, against Army Group North Ukraine, where the ground is good for tanks, and the prize is the direct route to Warsaw and Berlin. Here, in the dense, trackless Pripyat marshes, nothing stirs. The Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights report empty forests. The radio intercepts hear only routine garrison traffic. The quiet is deep. It is absolute. And it is a complete fabrication. This, then, is the central thesis. That the Red Army's single most decisive weapon in the Great Patriotic War was not the T-34 tank, nor the Katyusha rocket, nor even the human wave assault. It was a profound, institutional, and utterly ruthless doctrine of strategic deception. Maskirovka, a weapon of the mind that allowed the Soviets to repeatedly achieve impossible levels of strategic and operational surprise, crushing the Wehrmacht, not merely with superior numbers, but with phantom armies that materialized from the ether, turning the Eastern Front into a theater of ghosts. What the Landser of Army Group Center were experiencing was not peace. It was the calm at the epicenter of a hurricane, a void meticulously crafted by an entire state dedicated to the art of the lie. This single operation, codenamed Bagration, would become the doctrine's masterpiece, an act of strategic illusion so vast it would vaporize 3 German armies and break the spine of the Wehrmacht in the east. The German blindness was not accidental. It was cultivated. General Kurt von Tippelskirch, a sharp, professional officer serving as the chief of intelligence for Army Group Center, was one of the men staring into this engineered abyss. His reports, submitted to high command, reflected the consensus. His staff analyzed every scrap of data, prisoner interrogations, radio intercepts, aerial photographs, and concluded that the Soviet threat opposite his army group was minimal. The OKH, in its formal estimate of the 14th of June 1944, stated unequivocally that an offensive against Army Group Center can be regarded as improbable. All eyes were south. The Germans watched the sector opposite Army Group North Ukraine, where the Soviets were obligingly conducting noisy reconnaissance in force, running extensive radio traffic, and concentrating armor in plain sight. This visible buildup confirmed every German bias. As Tippelskirch would later write in his memoirs, the German command was thoroughly convinced that the Pripyat marshes were unsuitable for the deployment of large masses of troops. The Germans believed the marshes protected their northern flank. They failed to understand that the Soviets no longer viewed the marshes as an obstacle, but as a curtain. From the Soviet side, the deception was managed with paranoid precision. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, coordinating the offensive for the Soviet High Command, or Stavka, knew that the plan's success depended entirely on secrecy. The deception was not an afterthought. It was built into the operational plan from its very inception. In his memoirs, Zhukov detailed the extraordinary measures taken. The primary goal was to mislead the enemy concerning the true direction of the main blow. This involved a massive, multi-layered simulation. While the real assault armies moved into the forests opposite Army Group Center, they did so under the strictest Maskirovka protocols. All movement was nocturnal. Radio silence was absolute, with all orders transmitted via landline or courier. Daylight hours were spent in total concealment, with vehicles and artillery pieces camouflaged beneath dense forest canopy, and soldiers forbidden from lighting fires or even stepping into open clearings. Simultaneously, a massive phantom offensive was staged far to the south, near Lvov. Entire dummy tank corps were constructed from wood and canvas. Fake radio networks crackled to life, broadcasting the traffic of entire armies. Soviet divisions conducted loud, aggressive, and highly visible probing attacks, deliberately taking prisoners who would reveal the southern offensive. The Germans took the bait, moving their precious panzer reserves, including the formidable 5th SS Panzer Division, south directly away from the impending killing ground. The sheer scale of this illusion is what breaks the mind. The statistical hammer of Bagration reveals the true disparity between reality and the German perception. While General von Tipelskirch and the OKH estimated only minor Soviet reserve formations, the Stavka had secretly concentrated 4 entire fronts, army groups, comprising 166 divisions. This amounted to over 2.4 million men, more than 5,200 tanks and self-propelled guns, over 5,300 combat aircraft, and 26,000 artillery pieces. In the critical breakthrough sectors, Soviet commanders achieved numerical superiority over the Germans that was almost biblical. 10-1 in infantry, 7-1 in tanks, and 7-1 in artillery. German aerial reconnaissance, the supposed eyes of the army, had been rendered completely impotent. Soviet fighters aggressively patrolled the front lines, shooting down any German reconnaissance plane that attempted to cross. The few that did get through saw exactly what the Soviets wanted them to see: empty clearings and quiet roads. The Wehrmacht, an army that had built its reputation on rapid, incisive intelligence and swift action, was now functionally deaf and blind. What unfolded on the 22nd of June 1944, exactly 3 years to the day after the German invasion, was not a battle. It was an extermination. The phantom armies became real. The silent forests erupted in a man-made volcano of steel and fire that utterly eclipsed the opening salvos of Stalingrad or Kursk. For the soldiers of Army Group Center, the world simply ended. But this stunning victory was not a singular event. It was not a lucky break or a simple trick. Bagration was the final thesis presentation for a doctrine that had been forged in the fires of 1941, tested at Moscow, and refined into a deadly weapon at Stalingrad and Kursk. This was the Soviet way of war, a philosophy of total deception that had roots stretching back centuries, from the Potemkin villages to the deep battle theories of the 1930 seconds. To understand how the Red Army crushed the Reich, one must first understand the art of Maskirovka, the cataclysm of Operation Bagration that perfectly orchestrated annihilation of a German army group in 1944. Was not a sudden stroke of Soviet genius. It was not a desperate gamble invented in the crucible of war. It was the result of a military philosophy so deeply embedded in the Russian psyche that it was by then simply the way of war. This doctrine had roots that stretched back centuries, long before the red flag flew over the Kremlin, back to the glittering, deceptive court of the Tsars. The most famous, if perhaps embellished, example remains that of Grigory Potemkin. In 1787, as he escorted Catherine the Great on a tour of her newly acquired territories in the Crimea, legend holds that he constructed entire fake villages along the banks of the Dnieper River. These Potemkin villages, mere painted facades, were allegedly populated by happy, prosperous peasants, all for the benefit of the Empress's passing barge. While the scale of this deception is debated by historians, its endurance as a metaphor is what matters. It speaks to a core concept in Russian culture. Pokazuka. The act of putting on a show, of presenting a curated reality. It is the understanding that the perception of a thing is often more powerful than the thing itself. This cultural acceptance of illusion found its way into Tsarist military thought. The Western European military tradition, dominated by the Prussian theorist Karl von Clausewitz, was obsessed with the time's Schwerpunkt asterisk, the decisive point of battle where armies would meet in a singular, climactic, and honorable engagement. The Russian way of war was different. It was shaped by its own geography. A vast, unforgiving expanse, with few roads and brutal winters. Survival, not glorious battle, was the primary objective. When Napoleon's Grande Armée, the largest army Europe had ever seen, marched on Moscow in 1812, they found no decisive battle. Instead, they found a phantom. The Russian armies under Barclay de Tolly and later Kutuzov refused to engage, trading space for time. They retreated, scorching the earth, luring the French deeper into a void. They employed partisan warfare, harassing supply lines, and then simply waited for General Winter to assist in the annihilation. This was not seen as cowardly. It was seen as profoundly pragmatic. It was a strategy of asymmetric warfare where deception, strategic withdrawal, and the psychological exhaustion of the enemy were the primary weapons. This long-standing tradition of guile was seized upon and industrialized by the architects of the new Red Army in the 1920s. The crucible of the Russian Civil War and the disastrous Polish-Soviet War had taught the young Bolshevik commanders that revolutionary zeal was no match for professional military science. At the forefront of this new wave of thinking was a figure of Napoleonic ambition and intellect: Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky. Tuchachevsky and his fellow theorists, like Vladimir Triandafilov, looked at the brutal stalemate of the First World War's trenches and sought a way to restore mobility to warfare. Their answer was a doctrine so advanced it bordered on science fiction. Gluboki boy, or deep battle. This was not a plan for a single breakthrough. It was a theory for the simultaneous, full-depth assault of the Times' entire Times enemy operational system. Airplanes would bomb command centers and railway junctions. Paratroopers would be dropped deep in the rear to seize bridges and sow chaos. Massed artillery would vaporize the front line. And then, waves of infantry, supported by vast independent tank corps, would pour through the gaps, not stopping to fight, but driving hundreds of kilometers deep to encircle and annihilate the enemy's reserves. For this complex, symphonic doctrine to work, one element was non-negotiable. Внезапность. Or surprise. The enemy could not be allowed to know where or when the blow would fall. If he did, he would simply move his reserves and brace for the impact, turning the deep battle into another bloody attritional fight. And so, Tuchachevsky and his colleagues codified the ancient art of Russian deception into a formal, scientific military principle. They named it times Maskirovka, times literally, masking or concealment. In the Red Army's 1936 Field Regulations, PU-36, often called Tuchachevsky's masterpiece, Maskirovka was not just a suggestion, it was a foundational component of every operation. The regulations stated, "Surprise is achieved by the staggering of the enemy, by the novelty of methods applied, by the rapid and concealed concentration of forces, by the application of Maskirovka." This doctrine demanded the creation of dummy units, the construction of fake airfields and supply dumps, the rigid enforcement of radio silence, and the spreading of disinformation through captured agents. It was, in short, the institutionalization of the Potemkin village for the purpose of total war. The terrible central paradox of this story is what happened next. By 1937, the Red Army possessed, on paper, the most sophisticated and forward-thinking operational doctrine on Earth. It had conceptualized combined arms warfare, airborne operations, and strategic deception on a scale the Germans had not yet fully grasped, with their own times blitzkrieg asterisk. But the Red Army was an instrument of a state ruled by absolute, paranoid terror. Joseph Stalin, seeing Tuchachevsky's brilliance, his popularity, and his independent thought as a threat, ordered his arrest. In 1937, Tuchachevsky, the Red Napoleon, was tortured, subjected to a show trial, and executed. This was the beginning of the Great Purge. In the year that followed, Stalin systematically annihilated the leadership of his own army. 3 of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union were shot. 13 of 15 army commanders were shot. Over 35,000 officers, the very men who had studied, written, and understood the complexities of deep battle and Maskirovka, were imprisoned, sent to the Gulag, or shot in the cellars of the Lubyanka. As 1941 loomed, the Red Army was a schizophrenic giant. It held in its hands the field manuals, PU-36, which contained the theoretical keys to victory. But the brains that knew how to read them, the commanders with the experience, confidence, and training to orchestrate a deception as complex as Operation Bagration, were dead or in chains. The new officers, promoted overnight to fill the vacuum, were terrified of initiative. They clung to rigid, predictable, and approved battle plans. The doctrine of deep, deceptive, and flexible warfare was locked away, a heresy whose creators had been declared enemies of the people. This catastrophic void between theory and reality, between a brilliant doctrine and a terrified, decapitated officer corps, set the stage for the greatest military disaster in history, the German invasion of the 22nd of June 1941. At 3:15 on the morning of the 22nd of June 1941, the German Wehrmacht unleashed Operation Barbarossa. It was the largest, most powerful, and most technologically advanced invasion force ever assembled in the history of warfare. 3 million German soldiers, 3,600 tanks, and over 2,700 aircraft surged across a front line stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. For the German assault troops, the attack was a masterpiece of lethal precision. For the Soviet soldiers on the border, it was the apocalypse. The Red Army's frontline command and control network dissolved in minutes. Artillery batteries were destroyed before they could fire a shot. The Red Air Force was annihilated on the ground, its planes neatly parked in rows as if for an inspection. The theoretical, sophisticated doctrine of Maskirovka and deep battle, so brilliantly conceived by Tuchachevsky, was utterly absent. In its place was only paralysis, terror, and collapse. Barbarossa was not just a military failure for the Red Army, it was a catastrophic failure of intelligence, a complete rejection of its own deception-based doctrine, and the direct, bloody consequence of Stalin's purges. The supreme irony is that Stalin had been given the most precise, accurate, and timely intelligence of any leader in the war. The warnings were not vague, they were specific, and they came from his best sources. From Tokyo, the master spy Richard Sorge, operating under the cover of a German journalist with intimate access to the German embassy, transmitted multiple reports to Moscow. His most crucial dispatch, sent in mid-May, stated unequivocally that the German invasion would begin on or around June 22. From inside the Reich itself, agents of the Red Orchestra spy ring confirmed massive, inexplicable troop movements to the east. On the border, German deserters, risking their lives to cross the lines, warned their Soviet captors of the imminent attack. The warnings came from the very top of the Red Army itself. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko, the People's Commissar for Defense, and General Georgy Zhukov, Chief of the General Staff, watched the German buildup with growing horror. In his memoirs, Zhukov recounted their desperate, late-night attempts to convince Stalin to put the border districts on full combat alert. Stalin rejected them all. He was, in his own mind, engaged in a grand strategic deception of his own, believing that Hitler was merely posturing to extract political concessions. He was terrified that any Soviet military preparedness would be seen as a provocation, giving Hitler the very excuse he needed to attack. In his paranoia, Stalin had convinced himself that the evidence of 3 million German soldiers was the deception, and his own fantasy of a political negotiation was the reality. The result of this supreme self-deception was the greatest military collapse in modern history. The Red Army of 1,941 on paper was the largest in the world, possessing over 20,000 tanks more than the rest of the world's armies combined. But this was a statistical illusion. The Kesselschlachten or cauldron battles of that first summer were a brutal testament to the Red Army's tactical and operational incompetence. At Minsk-Bialystok, German armored pincers snapped shut around 2 entire Soviet armies, capturing 320,000 men. At Kiev, in September, the catastrophe was even greater. A single encirclement that netted the Germans 665,000 prisoners. General Heinz Guderian, commander of Panzer Group II, wrote in his memoirs, *Panzer Leader*, of his astonishment at the primitive Soviet tactics. He described how Soviet tank units, lacking radios and coordination, charged piecemeal, one by one, to be destroyed by concealed German anti-tank guns. Infantry launched suicidal, uncoordinated frontal assaults. The Red Army was doing the opposite times, of the purged Pu-36 doctrine. Instead of defense in depth, its forces were strung in a brittle line on the border. Instead of massed, combined arms counterstrokes, its units attacked sequentially. It was a leaderless, terrified, and headless giant, flailing wildly as the Wehrmacht systematically dismembered it. But the Wehrmacht, in its arrogance, had made its own fatal miscalculation. It had confused the Soviet Times state times with the Soviet Times people asterisk. By December 1941, the German spearheads were on the frozen outskirts of Moscow. The men were exhausted, the vehicles frozen solid, and the supply lines stretched to the breaking point. The Germans believed the Red Army was finished, that one final push would take the capital. It was here, in the forest before the city, that the brutal lessons of 1941 were finally, desperately applied. This was the Red Army's first true intellectual victory, the first glimmer of the doctrine that had been buried with Tuchachevsky. While the Germans froze, Stalin conducted his first great act of wartime Maskirovka. Richard Sorge, from his prison cell in Tokyo, he had finally been caught, sent one last, vital message. The Japanese Empire had decided to strike south against the United States and would not attack the Soviet Union in the east. Stalin immediately stripped the Far East of his best, most well-equipped, winter-acclimatized Siberian divisions. These armies were not thrown piecemeal into the fight. They were transported thousands of miles in secret, moved only at night, and concealed in the dense forests around Moscow. The Germans saw nothing. On the 5th of December 1941, when the German offensive had finally ground to a halt, the Soviets unleashed them. The shock was total. The Germans, who believed they were facing only shattered remnants, were struck by fresh, white camouflaged armies equipped for winter war. The counterstroke threw Army Group Center back, saving Moscow and handing the Wehrmacht its first undeniable strategic defeat of the entire war. This victory, born of desperation and enabled by a crucial piece of intelligence, was the proof of concept. It taught Stalin, Zhukov, and the new chief of staff, Alexander Vasilevsky, a lesson written in the blood of 3 million dead. That the Germans were not invincible. They could be fooled. They could be surprised. Tuchachevsky, the enemy of the people, had been right all along. Surprise, achieved through Maskirovka, was the only currency that could counter the Wehrmacht's tactical superiority. This lesson, learned in the snows of Moscow, would now be taken south, to the banks of the Volga, where the fate of the world would be decided at Stalingrad. Autumn 1942. The world's attention is focused on a single ruined city on the Volga River. Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army, under the methodical General Friedrich Paulus, has become consumed by the Times Rattenkrieg *, the Rat War. The fighting is a visceral, inhuman hell of sewer tunnels, shattered factories, and hand-to-hand combat in stairwells. For the German High Command, OKH, and for Hitler himself, the capture of the city bearing Stalin's name has transcended military strategy. It has become a profound psychological obsession. This tactical fixation, this desperate, bloody battle for every pile of rubble, is the perfect vulnerability. It is the bait. While the Sixth Army grinds itself to dust inside the city, it is blind to the operational level storm gathering on its vast, exposed, and weakly held flanks. The lesson of Moscow is about to be applied on a strategic scale, and the Red Army is using the burning city of Stalingrad as the anvil for a trap of monstrous proportions. The architect of this trap, along with Georgy Zhukov, was the meticulous chief of the General Staff, Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky. His memoirs, The Cause of My Whole Life detailed the chilling, pragmatic calculus made by the Stavka. The decision was made to deliberately sacrifice Soviet soldiers inside the city. General Vasily Chuikov's 62nd Army was to be fed just enough times men, just enough times ammunition, and just enough times supplies ferried across the Volga under constant, murderous German artillery fire to keep the fight going. Their mission was not to win the city, it was to hold the Sixth Army in place, to bleed it, and most importantly, to keep its attention fixed forward. As Vasilevsky wrote, the stubborn, heroic defense of Stalingrad enabled the High Command to gain the time it needed to prepare a powerful counteroffensive. While Zhukov's men died in the rubble, Vasilevsky and Zhukov massed 3 entire new Soviet fronts, army groups, on the flanks. The Maskirovka protocols were absolute. This was Moscow, magnified. All troop concentrations were built up at night, with over 1 million men, thousands of tanks, and tens of thousands of guns moving into position in total radio silence. To mislead German aerial reconnaissance, the Soviets built 5 false, heavily trafficked bridges across the Don River, far from the intended crossing points, while the real, underwater bridges were being constructed in secret. The German Sixth Army, focused intently on the city, paid almost no attention to its flanks. This was a fatal arrogance. Those flanks were not held by elite German troops. They were entrusted to their Axis allies, primarily the Romanian Third Army to the northwest and the Romanian Fourth Army to the south. These were armies in name, but they were exhausted, demoralized, and equipped with second-rate, obsolete weaponry. The warnings were not just ignored, they were treated with contempt. Romanian General Petre Dumitrescu, commanding the Third Army, was a competent officer who watched the Soviet buildup opposite his front with growing terror. He saw the new bridgeheads, heard the unmistakable sound of tank engines in the night, and interrogated prisoners who spoke of a massive offensive. He repeatedly sent desperate, pleading reports to the Sixth Army's headquarters and to OKH, warning that his men could not possibly hold against the concentration they were facing. He was told he was exaggerating, that his troops were cowardly, and that the Soviets were incapable of such an operation. The German leadership, blinded by their obsession with Stalingrad and their own racial arrogance, believed the flanks were secure. The statistical hammer reveals the lethal gap between German perception and Soviet reality. On the flanks, the Stavka had secretly massed the southwestern, Don, and Stalingrad fronts. This force numbered over 1.1 million soldiers, nearly 1,500 tanks, the vast majority of which were the superior T-34, and over 13,500 artillery pieces. This was the hammer. The anvil was the Romanian armies. General Dumitrescu's men were equipped with a handful of German-supplied anti-tank guns and a collection of obsolete, Czech-built Panzer 35 tanks. Their 37mm anti-tank guns were so useless against the T-34's sloped armor that German troops had nicknamed them times Herasanklovgerät, times the army doorknocker. They were, quite literally, cannon fodder, thinly stretched across a vast open steppe with no reserves. The Soviets had achieved a local superiority of 5-1 in infantry, 10-1 in armor, and 20-1 in artillery. On the 19th of November 1942, Operation Uranus began. The code word Siren was broadcast, and the 13,500 Soviet guns opened fire in a deafening, earth-shattering barrage that simply vaporized the Romanian front line. The T-34 seconds charged out of the fog and snow, and the Romanian Third Army ceased to exist. In the south, the next day, the same fate befell the Fourth Army. The Soviet armored pincers punched through the void, driving hard and fast for their objective. The bridge at Kalak na Donu, deep in the German rear. In just 4 days, they met. The trap clicked shut. General Paulus and the entire German Sixth Army, some 300,000 Axis troops, were caught. When the news reached Hitler at his Wolfslair headquarters, he was apoplectic, refusing to believe it. He had been focused on a city, while Zhukov and Vasilevsky had been focused on the map. Stalingrad was the Moscow lesson applied on a massive strategic scale. It was the Red Army's first perfect grade in its new brutal school of deception. It proved, beyond any doubt, that the Purge doctrine of Maskirovka was the key to annihilating the Wehrmacht. The victories at Moscow and Stalingrad were more than just triumphs. They were a proof of concept. They demonstrated that the Wehrmacht, despite its tactical brilliance, was psychologically rigid and susceptible to grand-scale deception. Stalin, Zhukov, and Vasilevsky had learned through blood that Tuchachevsky's Purge doctrine was the key. But to win the war, Maskirovka could not be a series of desperate one-time improvisations. It had to be industrialized. It had to be scaled up from a battlefield art into a continental-sized assembly line of lies. Beginning in 1943, the Stavka set out to do just that, creating a parallel war effort, whose only product was illusion. A new, specialized branch was established, the Stavka's Directorate of Operational Deception, to centrally coordinate and choreograph these illusions across all fronts, ensuring that the feint in the north perfectly complemented the real offensive in the south. The core of this new industrial process lay in the mass production of Times Makey asterisk, or models. This was the physical, tangible arsenal of the Ghost Armies, and its creation was tasked to specialized engineering and sapper battalions. The 1942 edition of the Times Sapper's Handbook Times became a blueprint for this work, filled with detailed schematics for building a phantom army. The most common was the dummy T-34 tank. Some were crude, just wooden frames covered in painted canvas, designed to fool aerial reconnaissance from a distance. Others were sophisticated inflatable rubber models that could be set up in minutes. These were complemented by thousands of wooden anti-tank guns, dummy artillery pieces carved from logs, and entire fleets of aircraft built from scrap wood and tin. This was the Potemkin village taken to its logistical extreme. Entire fake airfields were constructed, complete with wooden planes, simulated barracks, mess halls that produced smoke, and even fake runways. Small detachments of real soldiers would be assigned to these sites, tasked with creating the illusion of life, driving trucks around to create tracks, lighting fires, and running onto the airfield during feigned alerts, all for the benefit of the lone German reconnaissance pilot dutifully marking the new enemy airfield on his map. The second pillar of this industrialized deception was the mastery of the intangible, electronic and acoustic warfare. The Red Army understood that a modern army did not just occupy space, it occupied the electromagnetic spectrum. Thus, the doctrine of Times radio Maskirovka Times, radio deception, became a high art. Specialist signals units were formed with a unique mission: to simulate the radio traffic of an entire army. As described in the post-war memoirs of Soviet signals officers, these deception units would create a complex, artificial sound for a phantom force. They would broadcast thousands of messages using the unique call signs, encryption keys, and transmission schedules of a real tank army. They even replicated the unique fist, or Morse code sending style, of specific, known commanders to convince German radio intercept operators that a famous general and his army were massing in a quiet sector. While this phantom army talked, the Times real-time's assault army, preparing for the offensive hundreds of kilometers away, would go into absolute radio silence, communicating only by landline and courier. The Germans, listening intently, would hear a crescendo of activity in one place and silence in another, and would invariably move their reserves toward the noise. This was supplemented by acoustic deception, using specialized sound trucks, heavy vehicles equipped with massive loudspeakers that would be driven near the front lines at night to broadcast high-fidelity recordings of tank engines, clanking treads, artillery fire, and heavy construction, all to mask the sounds of the real units moving into position elsewhere. The statistical hammer of this effort reveals just how seriously the Stavka took this war of perception. This was not a handful of men with plywood. By 1944, entire Maskirovka battalions were being formed, and these were eventually grouped into specialized brigades, like the 23rd Guards Separate Deception Battalion, whose sole function was to perform this theater. The production of Times Makey Times was quantified. For the deception plan preceding the Belarusian offensive, Bagration, Soviet factories and sapper units produced over 1,200 dummy tanks, 2,500 dummy artillery pieces, and over 300 dummy aircraft. These were not just scattered, they were concentrated in specific, highly visible areas to create the illusion of entire tank corps. The manpower investment was equally significant. Tens of thousands of soldiers were employed not to fight, but to pretend times to fight, building fake trenches, driving decoy truck columns, often in endless loops, and operating the radio sets of the phantom armies. This industrial, centralized, and resource-intensive approach was a stark contrast to the, admittedly clever, deception efforts of the Western Allies, such as Operation Fortitude before D-Day, which tended to rely more heavily on a small number of double agents and specialized visual trickery. The Soviet system was less subtle, perhaps, but it was executed on a scale that was simply unimaginable to their German counterparts. By mid-1943, the German Wehrmacht was no longer fighting one Red Army, it was fighting two. The first was the real, lethal force, silent, concealed in forests, moving only at night, its orders passed by wire. The second was a vast, noisy, highly visible, and entirely fictitious army that existed only on German intelligence maps, on their radio intercept logs, and in the grainy photos from their reconnaissance planes. The Germans were now trapped in a shell game. Every time they detected a major Soviet buildup, their commanders were paralyzed by a single, unanswerable question. Is this the real army, or is this the ghost? This strategic paralysis, this inability to trust their own intelligence, was Maskirovka's greatest achievement. The Germans were about to make a fatal guess, betting all their reserves on the answer, at a place called Kursk. Spring 1943. The Wehrmacht is a wounded beast. The catastrophe at Stalingrad has cost it an entire army, and the myth of its invincibility is shattered. Now, desperate for a decisive victory to regain the strategic initiative, the German High Command, OKH, focuses its attention on a massive, 150-mile-wide bulge in the Soviet line, the Kursk salient. The plan, codenamed Operation Citadel, is a classic German pincer movement. A times Kesselschlacht, times in the making. Elite Panzer Corps, equipped with the new Panther and Tiger tanks, will strike from the north and south simultaneously, aiming to cut off the salient, trap over 1 million Soviet soldiers, and annihilate them. It is to be the Wehrmacht's great comeback, the decisive battle of the Eastern Front. What the Germans did not know was that the Soviets knew everything. Thanks to the Lucy spy ring operating out of Switzerland, which had astonishing access to OKH, and supplemented by frontline reconnaissance, the Stavka had a copy of the Citadel plan almost as soon as it was written. This perfect intelligence presented the Stavka with a profound strategic choice. The aggressive commanders, like Nikolai Vatutin, argued for a preemptive strike, an offensive to disrupt the German buildup before Citadel could even begin. But Marshal Zhukov and Vasilevsky, now fully committed to the doctrine of deception, proposed a radically different and far more patient strategy. Their argument, as detailed in Zhukov's memoirs, was chilling in its logic. Why attack them when they are so eager to attack us? They proposed to let the Germans come. They would times lure times Hitler's elite panzers into the salient, but the salient would be a trap. It would be the most extensive, deeply fortified killing ground in the history of warfare. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, commanding the Central Front in the north of the salient, the very man who would bear the brunt of the German attack, championed this idea. He argued that Maskirovka's role this time was not to hide an offensive, but to hide the true, horrifying depth times of the defense. The goal was to bleed the Panzerwaffe white on this anvil, to let them exhaust their strength, destroy their new tanks, and times only then to unleash the real Soviet offensive. The deception plan was twofold. First, they had to hide the anvil. The Red Army embarked on an unprecedented feat of military engineering. Inside the salient, Rokossovsky's and Vatutin's fronts constructed 8 separate defensive belts, stretching back over 150 miles. Over 5,000 miles of trenches were dug, often by local women and old men. Nearly 1 million anti-tank mines were laid, at a density of 5,000 per mile of front. But this network, the Fortitude, was useless if the Germans knew where its strong points were. So, Maskirovka was applied on a tactical level. The real-time anti-tank strong points, the pack fronts, massed batteries of 76.2 mm anti-tank guns, were dug in on reverse slopes, perfectly concealed from German observation and pre-bombardment. Meanwhile, thousands of dummy times positions were created. Fake anti-tank guns made of logs were placed in obvious forward slope positions. Dummy trench lines were dug. Fake airfields were built to draw Luftwaffe attacks, while the real air assets were dispersed on camouflage strips miles away. The Germans, in their pre-battle reconnaissance, marked these false positions on their maps, believing they had a clear picture of a strong, but brittle, Soviet defense. The second, and more critical, part of the deception was hiding the hammer. While the Germans focused all their intelligence assets on the salient itself, the Stavka was secretly building an entirely new army group in the deep rear, 200 miles to the east. This was the Steppe Front, commanded by General Ivan Konev. It was a massive strategic reserve, numbering over 500,000 men and 1,500 tanks. And its existence was a state secret. In his memoirs, Konev described the extreme Maskirovka protocols. This entire army group was forbidden from using radio. All movement, over hundreds of miles, was conducted only at night. During the day, its 500,000 men and 1,500 tanks would quarter in forests, with vehicles covered by camouflage nets and soldiers forbidden from even lighting cooking fires. Its purpose was to remain a complete unknown, a shadow offensive waiting in the wings. To complete the illusion, the Stavka's Deception Directorate staged a massive phantom times, build-up far to the south, near Kharkov, using fake radio traffic and dummy tank parks to convince the Germans that the main Soviet summer offensive would come there completely bypassing Kursk. On the 5th of July 1943, Operation Citadel began. The panzers, believing they were striking a well-charted but manageable line, surged forward. What they hit was the anvil. They plunged not into a line, but into a deep, elastic, and lethal defense that consumed them. The dummy positions drew their artillery fire, while the real, concealed pack fronts opened up at point-blank range, slaughtering the new Panthers and Tigers. The Germans fought for a week, grinding themselves to bloody ruin against a defense that seemed to have no end. When the Panzerwaffe was finally exhausted, its men spent, and its machines broken, the Stavka unleashed the hammer. On July 12, Konev's secret Steppe front, fresh, fully supplied, and completely unexpected, was committed to the battle. This led to the titanic clash at Prokhorovka, where the exhausted 2nd SS Panzer Corps was met by the fresh 5th Guards Tank Army. The German offensive collapsed. Kursk was more than a victory. It was the perfection of the Maskirovka doctrine, wedding it to a strategic defense in depth. It had successfully lured the Wehrmacht's last great reserve into a trap, bled it white, and then destroyed it, setting the stage for the final, unstoppable offensive that would begin 1 year later. Operation Bagration. This is the central paradox of the Eastern Front. How did the German Wehrmacht, an army whose 1,940 to 1,941 campaigns were case studies in brilliant staff work, rapid times Fühlung times, an intuitive, almost psychic feel for the battlefield, and seemingly omniscient intelligence, become so consistently, catastrophically blind? By 1943, the German High Command was functionally deaf and strategically sightless, stumbling from one Soviet-laid trap to the next. This was not a simple lack of data. It was a systemic, psychological, and, most critically, ideological failure to comprehend the very nature of Maskirovka. The organization responsible for this failure was the Times Fremde Heer Oost Times, FO, or Foreign Armies East, the Wehrmacht's military intelligence branch for the Eastern Front. Its failure was not one of observation, but of imagination. The head of the FHO, from 1942 onwards, was Colonel Reinhard Gehlen. Gehlen was not incompetent, quite the opposite. He was a brilliant, meticulous, and tireless analyst. His post-war memoirs, *The Service*, and the surviving FHO intelligence assessments show an organization that was superb at times tactical times intelligence. Gehlen's team could identify new Soviet divisions with astonishing accuracy. They obsessively counted tank production figures, analyzed captured equipment, and correctly estimated the Red Army's staggering casualty rates. Gehlen could see the what He knew how many times tanks the Soviets had. His catastrophic, repeated failure was his inability to ever understand the why or the where. He could not grasp Soviet strategic times intent asterisk. His analysis of the Kursk buildup is the quintessential example. His FHO correctly identified the massive concentration of men and armor in the salient, but applying a rigid Western European Clausewitzian logic, he concluded that this buildup was defensive times in nature, likely a prelude to a Soviet times retreat asterisk. He could not conceive that the Soviets would deliberately stand and absorb the German blow. He was looking at an anvil, but his entire education and doctrine told him it had to be a springboard. This analytical failure was fatally compounded by a profound ideological blindness. The German High Command, from Hitler down to the divisional staff officer, was infected with the Nazi ideology of the times Untermensch asterisk, the subhuman. They held a deep-seated racial arrogance that viewed the Slavic peoples as a primitive, disorganized Asiatic horde. In their minds, the Soviets were capable of brute force and human wave attacks, but not of subtlety, sophistication, or complex, multi-layered strategic deception. This stereotype became an impenetrable analytical wall. When German reconnaissance pilots returned with photographs of crude dummy tanks made of wood or entire airfields populated by canvas planes, the FHO and the frontline commanders did not see a clever feint. They saw proof of Soviet incompetence. They laughed. They interpreted it as a sign of a desperate, disorganized enemy wasting precious resources on childish tricks. The memoirs of commanders like Field Marshal Erich von Manstein and General Heinz Guderian are filled with this contempt. They consistently refer to the Red Army's Asiatic cunning, but they mean it in the sense of a sly peasant, not a grandmaster of strategy. They were simply, ideologically incapable times of believing that the primitive Slavic mind could orchestrate a deception as vast, as disciplined, and as intellectually demanding as Maskirovka. The Bagration miscalculation is the ultimate statistical hammer of this systemic failure. It is perhaps the single greatest intelligence blunder of the entire Second World War. By mid-June 1944, the FHO, under Galen, had finalized its official intelligence assessment for the coming Soviet summer offensive. This assessment, presented on maps to the German High Command, confidently and unequivocally placed the times entire times. Soviet strategic reserve, including the powerful 5th Guards Tank Army, far to the south. The FHO's consensus was absolute. The main Soviet blow would fall against Army Group North Ukraine, on the direct route to Warsaw. Conversely, the FHO designated Army Group Center, holding the Belarusian Bulge, as a quiet sector. Galen's maps showed this front as thinly held, with no significant Soviet reserves. This was the German reality. The actual reality, concealed in the forests and marshes, was the one described in Part 1. It was 2.4 million men. It was 5,200 tanks. It was 5,300 aircraft. Galen was not just wrong. He was wrong on a continental scale. He had misplaced the main enemy axis of attack by over 500 miles. His estimate of enemy strength in the actual times, breakthrough sector was off by a factor of 10. The German intelligence failure was total. It was a failure of data, as Soviet air superiority, partisan activity, and ruthless camouflage discipline successfully blinded German reconnaissance. It was a failure of analysis, as Galen's rigid doctrine prevented him from ever understanding the enemy's true intent, and most of all, it was a failure of imagination. The Wehrmacht was trapped in a lethal feedback loop of its own arrogance. It was fighting an enemy it refused to see, let alone understand. This total systemic blindness, this absolute conviction that the quiet on the Belarusian front was peace and not a void, had delivered Army Group Center, bound and gagged, to the Stavka's mercy. The stage was now set for the masterpiece, the grandest and most terrible illusion of the war, Operation Bagration. April 1944. Stalin's office in the Kremlin. The Stavka is planning the decisive blow of the war. After the victory at Kursk, the strategic initiative belongs to the Red Army, and the Wehrmacht is in a full, grinding retreat. The question is not times if times the Soviets will attack, but times where every conventional military instinct and all German intelligence pointed south. An attack through the open steppe of Ukraine, spearheaded by the Red Army's powerful tank corps, offered the most direct route to Warsaw, the oil fields of Romania, and Berlin itself. This was the obvious, logical, and expected blow. And it was precisely for this reason that a different, breathtakingly bold proposal was being laid on Stalin's map. The plan's champion was Marshal Konstantin Tuchachevsky, a man who had survived the purges, and he was pointing to a different sector entirely, Belarusia. He was proposing to strike not at Army Group North Ukraine, but at the quiet Army Group Center, a front that was protected by the impassable Pripyat marshes and the dense, trackless forests of the region. This was not just an attack plan. It was to be the final exam for the entire Maskirovka doctrine. The plan, as detailed by Marshal Vasilevsky and Marshal Zhukov in their memoirs, was Tuchachevsky's deep battle doctrine made real on a continental scale. It was a symphonic operation designed to achieve a full-depth rupture of the German front in 6 simultaneous places, followed by a massive, multi-pronged armored encirclement to trap and annihilate the entirety of Army Group Center. The audacity of the plan lay in its choice of terrain. The Germans, as their intelligence proved, considered the marshes and forests a natural fortress, unsuitable for a major mechanized offensive. The Stavka would use that assumption as a weapon, turning the forest into a cloak and the marshes into a hidden highway. The secrecy surrounding the plan was absolute. As General Sergei Stamenko of the General Staff later wrote, the operation was initially given a deliberate misspelling, Operation Bagration, with an R, to confuse any low-level staffer who might see it. The full details were known only to a handful of men: Stalin, Zhukov, Vasilevsky, and the 4 front commanders who would execute it. The plan's success depended entirely on the most complex, multi-layered deception in the history of warfare. The Stavka had to convince the German high command that their own, flawed analysis was correct. They had to make the Wehrmacht times look times south, while the real blow came from the center. This grand deception, as detailed in the memoirs of its orchestrators, had 3 main pillars. The first was the physical deception. Using the industrial methods perfected over the previous year, the Red Army's Maskirovka battalions began constructing a vast phantom army in the south, opposite Army Group North Ukraine. They built thousands of dummy tanks, wooden artillery pieces, and canvas aircraft, concentrating them in highly visible, noisy staging areas that were accidentally revealed to German reconnaissance. The second pillar was the radio deception. Specialized signals units, simulating the traffic of multiple tank armies, including most famously the 5th Guards Tank Army, began broadcasting a storm of messages from this southern sector. This phantom army had call signs, schedules, and command structures that German radio intercept services, like Gellen's FHO, had come to recognize. Meanwhile, the Times Real Times, 5th Guards Tank Army, and the 4 entire fronts destined for Bagration moved north under a blanket of total, absolute radio silence. The third and most unique pillar was the partisan deception. For years, over 150,000 Soviet partisans had been operating in the Belarusian forests, deep inside Army Group Center's rear. Hitherto, their mission had been one of harassment and intelligence gathering. Now, they were activated as a strategic weapon. In the days leading up to June 22, the Stavka unleashed them in a coordinated rail war. Partisan brigades struck the German railway network in over 10,000 places, blowing up tracks, derailing supply trains, and destroying communication lines. This had a dual effect. First, it paralyzed German logistics, preventing them from moving reserves or supplies. Second, it completed the intelligence blackout. The German 9th and 4th Armies were now cut off, unable to communicate with their rear or with OKH, just as the silent, invisible Soviet host was completing its final assembly. The statistical hammer of this concealment is what defies comprehension. This was not just a feint, it was a mass migration. The Stavka had to secretly move 4 army groups, 2.4 million men, into position. The 5th Guards Tank Army, the force the Germans were hearing in the south, was secretly redeployed over 500 miles to the north, its movements conducted entirely at night, its vehicles camouflaged during the day. In the weeks before the attack, the Red Army stockpiled 400,000 tons of ammunition, 300,000 tons of fuel, and 500,000 tons of other supplies, all moved by truck and handcart into hidden forest dumps. Not a single one of these massive preparations was detected by German intelligence. The FHO's maps remained unchanged. The Wehrmacht, confident in its analysis, continued to believe the Belarusian front was a quiet sector, held by a thinly stretched, exhausted enemy. By the 21st of June 1944, the trap was set. The illusion was complete. The greatest phantom army in history had concealed the greatest real times army ever assembled. The soldiers of Army Group Center sat in their fortifications, blind, deaf, and arrogant, completely oblivious to the fact that they were outnumbered 10-1 in the breakthrough sectors. They were about to be struck by an enemy they did not believe existed, in a place they had been told was impassable. The masterpiece of Maskirovka was complete, and the curtain was about to rise on the Wehrmacht's annihilation. 5. The 22nd of June 1944. Exactly 3 years to the day since the German invasion. On the Belarusian front, the German soldiers of Army Group Center are stirring in the morning quiet. Then the world ends. The sky is torn open, and the earth begins to heave. This is the Soviet god of war, their artillery, unleashed in a concentration never before seen. Across a 500-mile front, 26,000 guns, heavy mortars, and Katyusha Stalin organ rocket launchers erupt in a single, deafening, synchronized roar. It is not a bombardment, it is a geological event. The sound is a physical weight, a crushing, endless thunder that liquefies the senses. The forests, which the Germans had seen as their best defense, are pulverized, instantly reduced to splintered, burning matchsticks. In the German command bunkers, the shock is absolute. The first, frantic reports from the front lines are not of an attack, but of a total, systemic dissolution. This is not a probe. This is an execution. The front line, held by the German 9th and 4th Armies, simply ceased to exist. All communications were severed in the first salvo. The meticulously laid German minefields were detonated by the sheer concussive force of the barrage. The well-constructed bunkers, designed to withstand a normal attack, were crushed like paper. In the official war diary of Army Group Center, the entries for 5 to 7 are a testament to this shock. A sudden, total, and terrifying silence. All frontline corps, the 35th, the 12th, the 27th went off the air simultaneously, as if they had never been. The few survivors who staggered back, deafened and shell-shocked, told impossible stories. The diaries of German soldiers from this sector, those that survived, speak not of a battle, but of an apocalypse. They describe the ground itself erupting, of men simply vanishing in fountains of red earth, of a noise so profound it seemed to come from inside their own skulls. General Kurt von Tippelskirch, the intelligence chief who had promised this was a quiet sector, could only watch in horror as his entire operational map, the product of months of careful, arrogant analysis, disintegrated in less than 2 hours. Then, the tanks came. This was Tuchachevsky's deep battle doctrine, performed with a brutal, symphonic perfection. The first wave of Soviet rifle divisions surged through the smoking, cratered void, tasked with mopping up the dazed, shattered remnants of the German forward line. But the Times, Real Times offensive, the armored spearheads of the mobile groups and the 5th Guards Tank Army, did not stop to fight. Following their sappers who cleared paths through the wreckage, they plunged directly into the German operational rear. The memoirs of Soviet tank commanders from this day are filled with a sense of dizzying, unstoppable momentum. They describe rolling past German strongpoints that were still frantically firing at the riflemen behind them, their T-34 seconds focused only on the objective, the bridges, the highways, and the command centers deep behind the lines. They drove for the Berezina River, the same river where Napoleon's Grande Armée had met its end. and their ultimate prize, Minsk, the capital of Belarusia, and the central nervous system of Army Group Center. The statistical hammer of this annihilation is what defines Operation Bagration as the Wehrmacht's greatest single defeat. The speed of the collapse was breathtaking. The Soviet armored pincers, driving from the north and south, bypassed the main German infantry formations and snapped shut at Minsk on the 3rd of July 1944. It had taken just 11 days. The bulk of the German 4th Army and 9th Army was now trapped in a vast times Kessel, times east of the city. But unlike Stalingrad, there would be no airlift, no fortress, and no protracted defense. The encirclement was immediately shattered by overwhelming Soviet power. The numbers are a eulogy for an entire army group. In just over 3 weeks of fighting, 28 of Army Group Center's 34 divisions were effectively destroyed. The Wehrmacht had lost over 350,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. It was a loss of manpower and material far greater, and far more rapid, than the catastrophe at Stalingrad. The final humiliating proof of this victory came on the 17th of July 1944. As a final, grand act of times Pokazuka times a show for the world, Stalin ordered 57,000 German prisoners, captured during Bagration, to be marched through the streets of Moscow. The column of defeated men, including 22 shell-shocked generals, shuffling past the jeering crowds, was a symbolic and psychological blow from which the German officer corps would never recover. Bagration was not just a battle. It was the total, bloody vindication of the Maskirovka doctrine. It was the moment the Potemkin village became a strategic weapon of annihilation. The German Wehrmacht had been lured into a state of total blindness by its own arrogance and a perfectly orchestrated Soviet illusion. The quiet front was now a 400-mile wide breach in the German line. The phantom armies had become real, and in doing so, had broken the spine of the Wehrmacht in the east. The highway to Berlin was now wide open. The grand strategic deceptions that led to the encirclement at Stalingrad, the grinding down of the panzers at Kursk, and the annihilation of Army Group Center during Bagration were not sterile plans, authored and executed solely by the titans in the Stavka. The memoirs of Stalin, Zhukov and Vasilevsky tell the story of the what and the where, but they only hint at the how. Maskirovka was not a memo. It was a mass participation theater. It was a grand collective performance that required the active, disciplined, and often terrified compliance of millions of people. It was an illusion built by the frontline general forced to maintain a facade of normalcy, by the partisan living in the forest, by the sapper unit building fake tanks in the dead of night, and by the individual rifleman forbidden, on pain of death, from lighting a simple cooking fire. This was the human element. The actors who made the phantoms real. The blue-collar work of this grand illusion fell to the anonymous heroes of the Red Army, the sappers and the engineers. Theirs was not the glorious high-momentum charge of the T-34, but the grueling, meticulous, and dangerous labor of building the ghost armies. As the Red Army's deception doctrine industrialized, entire sapper battalions were dedicated to this craft. Their field manuals, like the 1942 times Sapper's Handbook **, were filled with schematics for times makey times, models. This was backbreaking, nocturnal work. It meant spending weeks in frozen, muddy forests, stretching heavy, tarred canvas over wooden frames, to create 1,000 dummy T-34 seconds that had to pass inspection from a Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane at 2,000 feet. It meant building entire fake airfields, complete with wooden aircraft, canvas barracks, and decoy signal fires, all to draw German bombs away from the real, camouflaged airstrips. Perhaps most critically, it meant laying thousands of miles of new communications wire. With times radio Maskirovka, times radio deception. In effect, the real assault armies were forbidden from broadcasting. Every order, every scrap of communication, had to travel by buried landline or courier. This meant sappers crawling on their bellies, often in sight of German listening posts, spooling out wire kilometer after kilometer, connecting the hidden command posts in a vast, silent, and physical web. The 4 million men assembled for Bagration were not just hidden. They were wired times together, in secret, by hand. Deep inside the German rear, another set of actors played a critical role. The Belarusian partisan movement, numbering over 150,000 fighters, was the Stavka's secret weapon. Panteleimon Ponomarenko, the political head of the partisan movement, coordinated their actions directly with the front commanders. Their most famous contribution was the Rail War, the massive, synchronized sabotage campaign that paralyzed German logistics just before Bagration. But their role in Maskirovka was more subtle and just as important. They were the intelligence gatherers, the ground truth that confirmed German unit locations. More than that, they were agents of disinformation. Partisan units would deliberately spread rumors in villages, knowing the information would get back to German collaborators, and thus to the FHO. They leaked false information about low morale, about mass desertions, and, most critically, about the Red Army's obvious preparations for a major offensive far to the south, in Ukraine. They would allow captured German soldiers, who had been fed this disinformation, to escape and carry the false news back to their units. The partisans were, in effect, reinforcing the German High Command's own biases from the inside. They were the actors on the ground who confirmed the Phantom Army in the south was real, making the silence in Belarusia even more believable. Finally, there was the psychological pressure on the commanders and the ruthless, simple discipline imposed on the average rifleman. This was perhaps the most critical human element. For a commander like Marshal Tukhachevsky, the burden of knowledge was immense. For months leading up to Bagration, he had to manage the secret assembly of over 1 million men in his front sector, all while maintaining a perfect, boring facade of normal garrison duty. He had to issue routine orders, conduct fake inspections of his real, forward defenses, and even respond to minor German probing attacks in a way that seemed weak and disorganized, all to lull Army Group Center into a deeper sleep. For the common soldier, the rules were simpler and far more brutal. He did not know the grand plan. He only knew the new orders, and he knew they were enforced not just by his officers, but by the watchful eyes of the NKVD, the secret police. A single unauthorized radio transmission, a stray cooking fire spotted by a Focke-Wulf reconnaissance plane, or even the muddy tracks of a supply truck left in an open clearing, could betray the entire operation and cost millions of lives. The punishment was summary and absolute. Execution. This was not a secret kept by patriotism alone. It was a secret enforced by a system of institutionalized terror that prioritized the success of the operation above the life of any individual. The silence of the 2.4 million men in the Belarusian forests was the silence of discipline, but it was also the silence of fear. The ultimate success of Maskirovka, therefore, was a testament to this uniquely Soviet combination. It was the strategic genius of the Stavka, layered on top of the industrial-scale craft of the engineers, multiplied by the clandestine work of the partisans. But it was all held together by the final, unquantifiable advantages the Germans could never hope to match. A top-down, ruthless authority that could impose absolute silence on millions, and the stoic, patriotic, and fatalistic endurance of the individual Russian soldier. He was willing to freeze, to suffer, and to obey in silence, becoming a willing participant in the theater of millions. This collective buy-in to the grand lie, whether by choice or by terror, was the living engine of the deception. In the same sweltering weeks of June 1944 that the Red Army was vaporizing Army Group Center, the Western Allies were tearing their own hole in Hitler's fortress Europe. The D-Day landings of the 6th of June 1944 were a staggering feat of arms, a cross-channel invasion of unparalleled scale and complexity. And just like its Soviet counterpart, it was supported by its own legendary, intricate, and brilliantly successful deception, Operation Fortitude. This historical coincidence provides the perfect lens for a comparative analysis. Both operations were designed to fool the German High Command, and both succeeded. But they were not the same. Fortitude was a sophisticated, scalpel-sharp tactical feint. Maskirovka, as demonstrated by Bagration, was a brutal, industrial-scale, all-consuming strategic doctrine. It was the difference between a magician's trick and a state-sponsored religion of illusion. Operation Fortitude was, without question, a masterpiece of intelligence work. Its primary architect was the XX Committee, or the double-cross system, a small, highly secretive branch of MI5 that ran every single German agent in Britain, having captured them all. These agents had been turned, and were now dutifully feeding a stream of meticulously crafted disinformation back to their handlers in the Abwehr. The crown jewel of this system was Agent Garbo, a Spanish double agent named Juan Pujol Garcia, who had so completely earned the trust of the Germans that they awarded him the Iron Cross for his services, while the British were simultaneously awarding him the MBE. Through Garbo and other channels, the Allies built their illusion. This illusion was the first U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG. This massive, entirely phantom army was supposedly quartered in Kent, in southeast England, and commanded by the one general the Germans feared most, George S. Patton. The deception was supported by the radio deception of Operation Quicksilver, which created the full radio signature of FUSAG, and by the physical deception of Operation Bodyguard, which saw thousands of inflatable rubber tanks, canvas-covered landing craft, and wooden aircraft concentrated in the fields and harbors opposite Pas de Calais. The German High Command, particularly Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, swallowed the deception whole. They were convinced that Normandy was a diversionary attack, and that Patton's FUSAG would deliver the Times' real decisive blow at Pas de Calais, the shortest route across the Channel. This is where the first crucial difference appears. Fortitude's primary goal was, in a sense, tactical Times, and Times temporary *. Its mission was to convince the Germans to hold their powerful 15th Army at Pas de Calais, after Times the real landings had already begun. It was designed to protect the fragile Normandy beachhead, to prevent Hitler from releasing his strategic panzer reserves and driving the Allies back into the sea. It succeeded perfectly, holding those 19 German divisions in place for crucial weeks. By contrast, Bagration's goal was Times strategic Times, and Times total *. Its purpose was not merely to pin reserves. Its purpose was to mislead the Times' entire German High Command about the Times' main strategic offensive of the summer, luring their gaze 500 miles south to Ukraine. It was not designed to protect a beachhead, but to enable the complete, surprise annihilation of an entire 350,000-man army group. The second difference is the sheer, brutal scale. Fortitude was, at its heart, a deception of the few. It was a sophisticated, high-intellect masterpiece run by a small cadre of brilliant intelligence officers at the XX Committee. It relied on a handful of double agents, specialized radio operators, and a few thousand pieces of dummy equipment. The Soviet deception for Bagration, on the other hand, was a deception of the millions. It too had its phantom armies and its thousands of dummy tanks. But its true decisive component was not the Times creation times of a phantom army, but the Times concealment times of a real one. The core of the Bagration deception was the secret, nocturnal, radio-silent movement of 2.4 million real soldiers, 5,200 real tanks, and 26,000 real artillery pieces. While Fortitude used rubber tanks to make the Germans look at Kent, Maskirovka made 2.4 million men times invisible times in Belarusia. This points to the final, profound philosophical divide: the method and the ruthlessness. The Allied deception was clean. It was run by spies, radio waves, and rubber. The Soviet doctrine of Maskirovka was a total, all-consuming industrial process that embraced a level of human sacrifice and state terror that was unique to the Soviet system. The enforcement of the radio silence for Bagration was not just a memo, it was a death sentence, handed down by the NKVD, for any soldier who broke it. The bait at Stalingrad was not a double agent, it was the 62nd Army, sacrificed in the city's rubble to hold the German 6th Army in place. The actors were not just a few sappers building plywood planes, but 150,000 partisans waging a real bloody rail war in the German rear. Maskirovka weaponized the state itself, from its intelligence organs to its secret police, its industrial base, and its stoic, terrified, and expendable population. In the end, both deceptions were stunning, war-winning successes. Operation Fortitude saved thousands of Allied lives, ensured the Normandy beachhead would not be overrun, and sealed the fate of the German army in France. It was a brilliant, elegant, and humane masterpiece of intelligence. But Maskirovka, as demonstrated by Bagration, was something else entirely. It was not just a plan. It was a doctrine of total war. It was a philosophy that embraced illusion, secrecy, industrial scale, and human sacrifice in a way the Western Allies never could or would. It was a theater of millions where the price of a ticket was absolute obedience, and the price of a missed cue was death. This brutal, totalizing doctrine had annihilated the Wehrmacht in the East, and it would not be forgotten when the guns of the Second World War fell silent. August 1945. The war in Europe is a fresh grave. The German Reich, which was to have lasted 1,000 years, is a smoking ruin. The world's attention has turned to the vast expanse of the Pacific, where the United States has just unleashed a new and terrible sun, the atomic bomb, over the city of Hiroshima. But another, final act of the global conflagration is about to begin. At the Yalta Conference months earlier, Stalin had promised his Western allies, Roosevelt and Churchill, that he would enter the war against the Japanese Empire within 3 months of Germany's defeat. That deadline was now approaching. The Japanese and the Allied intelligence services watched the Trans-Siberian Railway, the single, tenuous artery connecting European Russia with the Far East, for any sign of a Soviet buildup. They saw nothing. There was no surge of radio traffic, no massing of armies on the Manchurian border. The front was quiet. It was the Belarusian silence, all over again. This was to be Maskirovka's final, perfect performance, a stunning postscript to the war against a new, unsuspecting and arrogant enemy, the vaunted Japanese Kwantung Army. The deception was orchestrated by the Red Army's finest. Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, fresh from orchestrating the capture of East Prussia, was secretly appointed commander-in-chief of all Soviet forces in the Far East. His journey from Moscow was a case study in personal Maskirovka. As he recounts in his memoirs, he traveled incognito, under the name of Colonel General Vasilyev, his rank demoted, his identity hidden even from his own subordinate staff, until the last possible moment. His mission was to oversee one of the largest and fastest secret logistical transfers in history. The Stavka had to move over 1.5 million men, thousands of tanks, and tens of thousands of guns across 6,000 miles of the Trans-Siberian Railway. To do this, they weaponized the bureaucracy of demobilization. Entire armies, hardened by 4 years of war against the Wehrmacht, such as the elite 6th Guards Tank Army, were disbanded. Their movements eastward were disguised on all paperwork as resettlement of demobilized troops, training transfers, or agricultural labor details. The troops themselves, packed into endless trains, had their divisional markings painted over, and were forbidden from communicating with the outside world. The railway itself was put under total military control, with all civilian traffic suspended to allow an endless, high-speed, and secret stream of military transports to flow east. The Japanese intelligence failure was a perfect echo of the German one. The leadership of the Kwantung Army, the force that occupied and exploited Japanese-held Manchuria, was trapped in its own cocoon of arrogance. Their post-war interrogations and the records from Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo reveal a catastrophic underestimation of their new enemy. First, they believed the Soviet Union was economically shattered, bled white by the war with Germany, and physically incapable of launching another major offensive. Second, they fatally miscalculated the logistical capacity of the Trans-Siberian Railway, believing it could not possibly support a force large enough to threaten them. And third, just like the Germans in Belarusia, they put their ultimate faith in geography. They believed the vast, waterless Gobi Desert and the impassable forested peaks of the Greater Khingan Mountains formed a natural, impenetrable barrier on their western flank. They had accordingly concentrated their main defensive fortifications on the flat, open plains in the east, leaving the impassable west virtually undefended. The August Storm, as the offensive was codenamed, began at midnight on the 9th of August 1945, just hours after the atomic bombing of Nagasaki. It was deep battle perfected, a lightning-fast blitzkrieg that made the German campaign of 1,940 look sluggish. The Soviet force was overwhelming, 1.6 million men, 26,000 artillery pieces, and over 5,500 tanks and self-propelled guns. The Japanese had prepared for a conventional grinding border assault. What they got was a multi-pronged invasion that simply ignored their fortifications. The true genius of the plan was the 6th Guards Tank Army. Hardened in the fires of Kursk, Bagration, and the Vienna offensive, they did not attack the Japanese border. They did the impossible. They bypassed the border entirely by surging through the impassable Gobi Desert and over the Greater Khingan Mountains. Soviet after-action reports describe a brutal, high-speed advance. The tanks, often running low on fuel and water, simply drove straight for their objectives, achieving total strategic surprise. They appeared 100 to 200 kilometers deep in the Japanese rear in a matter of days, their T-34 seconds suddenly rolling into Japanese-held cities, cutting all communication lines, seizing airfields, and creating a panic from which the Kwantung Army never recovered. The Japanese command structure, which had been expecting a border skirmish, simply disintegrated. The million-man Kwantung Army, the pride of the Japanese Empire, dissolved in less than 2 weeks. The Manchurian strategic offensive was the final, flawless synthesis of Maskirovka and deep battle. It was a perfect deception, built on the logistical smoke and mirrors of the Trans-Siberian Railway, followed by a textbook high-speed offensive that exploited a psychological and geographical vulnerability the enemy believed was a strength. This stunningly rapid victory, which came at a fraction of the cost of the war in Europe, had profound consequences. It secured Soviet dominance over Manchuria and North Korea, directly shaping the post-war map of Asia. It was a primary, if often overlooked, factor in Emperor Hirohito's decision to finally surrender, ending the Second World War. And, perhaps most ominously, it served as a terrifying, final demonstration of the Red Army's doctrinal power for their new emerging rivals. Their former, and now deeply unsettled, Western allies. The Ghost Armies had performed their final act. When the guns of the Second World War fell silent in 1945, the doctrine of Maskirovka was not retired. It was not archived as a curious wartime relic. Instead, it was celebrated, studied, and institutionalized, becoming a central, defining pillar of Soviet statecraft and military strategy for the next half-century. The Cold War, a global nuclear-armed standoff defined by perception, ideology, and psychological warfare, was the perfect environment for a doctrine based entirely on the manipulation of reality. The ghost armies of Bagration and Manchuria did not vanish. They simply put on new masks, adapted to a new kind of conflict, and continued their work against a new primary adversary, the West. The first major post-war demonstration of this philosophy was a stunning, almost theatrical act of times Pokazuka times the show. At the 1955 Tushino Air Show, the Soviet Union was keen to prove it had broken the American monopoly on intercontinental heavy bombers. As Western air attachés, including U.S. General Thomas S. Power, watched with binoculars a squadron of 10 brand-new Myasishchev M4 Bison jets, the Soviet answer to the B-52, thundered overhead. It was an impressive display, but then, minutes later, another squadron of 10 Bisons appeared, followed by another. The attachés counted. By the end of the show, they had counted nearly 30 of these massive, terrifying bombers. Panic set in. Their reports flashed back to Washington, concluding that the Soviets were mass-producing the M4 on a scale the West could not match. This was the birth of the bomber gap, a wave of political and military hysteria that fueled a massive, panicked acceleration of the U.S. arms race. The truth was a pure Potemkin village. The Soviets had only 10 M4 seconds in service. They had simply flown the same-time squadron in a continuous, wide loop, out of sight of the observers, and rejoined the parade again and again. It was a cheap, brilliant, and stunningly effective deception that cost almost nothing and reshaped American defense policy. The doctrine showed its far more dangerous side in 1962. Operation Anadir was the Soviet code name for the secret deployment of nuclear-armed ballistic missiles to Cuba, and it was a direct descendant of the Bagration deception. As Nikita Khrushchev recounted in his memoirs, the entire operation was a masterpiece of Maskirovka. The goal was to install a strategic nuclear arsenal in America's backyard, before the Americans even knew it was happening. The secrecy was total. The missiles, warheads, and launch equipment were loaded onto transport ships disguised as routine freighters, their holds modified to hide their cargo from aerial surveillance. The thousands of soldiers and technicians sent to man the sites were given skis, winter parkas, and fur-lined boots, and were told they were being deployed to the Arctic. This was a classic piece of Maskirovka. If the information did leak, U.S. intelligence would be sent looking in the wrong direction. The operation brought the world to the very brink of nuclear annihilation, and its initial success was due entirely to the Soviet institutional mastery of concealment, a skill honed in the forests of Belarusia. This doctrine has not faded with the fall of the Soviet Union. It remains a formal, codified, and central part of modern Russian military thought. Today, it has been adapted for the 21st century under the umbrella of new generation warfare or hybrid warfare, concepts often associated with the writings of Russian Chief of Staff, General Valery Gerasimov. The core principles of Venezapnost, surprise, skritnost, concealment, and the manipulation of perception are unchanged. But the tools have evolved. The ghost armies are no longer just dummy tanks and radio operators. In the 21st century, they are troll farms that flood social media to sow political division. They are cyber attackers who breach power grids and electoral systems. They are little green men, professional soldiers in unmarked uniforms, who appear in places like the Crimea, their presence officially denied by the state, creating a fog of ambiguity. This modern doctrine has a name for its ultimate goal: reflexive control. This is the art of feeding an opponent such perfectly curated, deceptive information that they voluntarily choose to take the action that is most favorable to you, all while believing they are acting of their own free will. We began in the quiet, eerie forests of Belarusia, in the theater of phantoms, with German soldiers staring into a void they mistook for peace. The thesis was that the Red Army's greatest weapon was not the T-34, but its mastery of deception. That doctrine, forged in the Tsarist past, codified by Tuchachevsky, beaten into the Red Army by the catastrophe of 1941, and perfected at Stalingrad, Kursk, and Bagration, has proven to be the most enduring, flexible, and powerful weapon in the Russian arsenal. From the painted facades of Potemkin's villages to the phantom bombers of Tushino, from the invisible armies of Bagration to the ambiguous cyber armies of the modern day, the lesson is the same. The Russian way of war is not just about the application of force. It is about the complete, strategic, and ruthless manipulation of reality. The ghost armies are not a historical footnote. They have simply, once again, changed their form.